This morning, our scripture reading is Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verse 12 through 26, and you can find this on your Pew Bible after the book of Proverbs on page 472. Again, our scripture reading this morning is from Ecclesiastes 2, verse 12 through 26. Then I turned my thoughts to consider wisdom, and also madness and folly. What more can a king's successor do than what has already been done? I saw that wisdom is better than folly, just as light is better than darkness. The wise man has eyes in his head, while the fool walks in the darkness. But I came to realize that the same fate overtakes them both. Then I thought in my heart, the fate of the fool will overtake me also. What then do I gain by being wise? I said in my heart, this too is meaningless, for the wise man, like the fool, will not be long remembered. In days to come, both will be forgotten. Like the fool, the wise man too must die. So I hated life, because the work that is done under the sun was grievous to me. All of it is meaningless, a chasing after the wind. I hated all things I had toiled for under the sun, because I must leave them to one who comes after me. And who knows whether he will be a wise man or a fool? Yet he will have control over all the work into which I have poured my effort and skill under the sun. This too is meaningless. So my heart began to despair over all my toilsome labor under the sun. For a man may do his work with wisdom, knowledge, and skill, and then he must leave all he owns to someone who has not worked for it. This too is meaningless and a great misfortune. What does a man get for all the toil and anxious striving for which he labors under the sun? All his days his work is pain and grief. Even at night his mind does not rest. This too is meaningless. A man can do nothing better than to eat and drink and find satisfaction in his work. This too, I see, is from the hand of God. For without him, who can eat or find enjoyment? To the man who pleases him, God gives wisdom, knowledge, and happiness. But to the sinner, he gives the tasks of gathering and storing up wealth to hand it over to the one who pleases God. This too is meaningless, a chasing after the wind. May God bless the reading of his word.
Benji, open that door! Come on. Come on. Yes, got it! That's the wrong door! Benji, not that door, the other door! The other door, right? Yes, the other door. Okay, yes, sorry.
Exactly, ouch. So is your adrenaline running? Yeah? How many of you guys have seen that movie before? So like maybe 20% of you guys. How many of you guys haven't? All right, that wasn't everyone. Everyone who didn't just raise their hand the first time should have been raising their hand the second time. How many of you guys haven't seen that movie? Yeah, okay. So what do you think exactly is happening right now in that movie? Oh, craziness. Okay. So maybe I'll ask a different question. Why do you think Tom Cruise was trying to get on that plane? And we'll do this multiple choice. I'll give you guys 3 choices, and all of you guys have to pick one, okay? So if you have no idea what the answer is, just throw your hand up for one of them. If you're confused, just throw your hand up. So choice A, the President of the United States is on that plane, and Tom Cruise has to get on that plane to rescue him. Choice B, there's a super weapon, and the controls for that super weapon are on that plane, and Tom Cruise has to get there to disable that super weapon. Or choice 3, One of Tom Cruise's team has been infected with a virus, and the antidote for that virus is sitting on that plane, and he has to go there and retrieve that antidote. So choice A, choice B, choice C. Who says choice A? Rescue the president. You have to vote for one of them, okay? All right, not that many people. Choice B, disable superweapon. Okay, most of you guys. All right, choice C, the antidote for the virus. So most of you guys voted for choice B. So the truth is, I have never watched this movie. So I have no idea. I just made all that up, all right? And what this exercise kind of shows us is that when you jump into the middle of something, it can be kind of hard to understand what's going on, right? I mean, if you don't know what has happened throughout the rest of the movie from the beginning up until this point, you can draw some pretty bad conclusions as to what's going on. And so as we look at the passage for today in Ecclesiastes, it's really difficult to understand what's happening unless we've seen what has happened up until this point in Ecclesiastes. The author of Ecclesiastes, the teacher, has been making his argument, and we're jumping right into the middle of that argument. And as we read this passage, as exciting as it might be, I mean, it could be as exciting as Tom Cruise trying to get on a plane. If we don't look at the surrounding context, then we can miss the forest for the trees. And those trees, as beautiful as they might be, could cause us to draw a completely wrong conclusion about what that forest exactly looks like. So to help us crack open the text a little bit more, including understanding what the passage looks like in its literary context, here's Pastor Tim.
Chris is a hard act to follow. Here's the point. How do we understand a passage like Ecclesiastes, especially when we only have time to consider half of a chapter and we're jumping into the middle of the chapter? So the point that Chris is trying to make and we're trying to make this morning is that when you understand Ecclesiastes, you have to understand any particular verse in the context of not only what has gone before, but the entire book. So what have we seen so far? We've seen that I got a little bit of a reverb up here, Sammy. Can you tone me down a little bit? Sounds like I'm in a toilet. And I don't like preaching from the toilet. I like reading my text messages. Okay, so it's a little bit better, but still sounds a little bit swimming there. Okay, it's getting better. So when we go through Ecclesiastes, what we've seen up to this point is that the writer to Ecclesiastes is trying to make sense of life under the sun. He's trying to look out in life and say, okay, it is what it is. So half the time when we read Ecclesiastes, we find that the writer of Ecclesiastes is saying, this is how it is. And occasionally, he lapses into another perspective and he says, this is how it should be for the people who walk with God and who know God. So when you read Ecclesiastes, you've got to always ask yourself, is he just describing what is, or is he saying this is the way it should be? So up to this point, even in chapter 2, what we've seen as he looks out, he considers life from the perspective of people who try and find meaning in life through pursuing pleasure or through pursuing possessions. Now, how many of you today, and we'll do another raise your hand, how many of you are trying to find meaning in life through pursuing pleasure? Whatever that pleasure is. Raise your hands. Let's be honest, okay? We've got a few pleasure seekers out here. All righty, good. How many of you are trying to find meaning in your life through possessions, which can be acquired when you have enough money to buy them? Raise your hand. I see some honest people in the back, okay? The rest of you, are you pursuing meaning in life? Okay, well, maybe you're going to fall into the passage that we have today, because last week we tried possessions, we tried pleasure, and we ended up with meaningless. Those of you who are pursuing pleasure, it's meaningless, it's fleeting, it's here today and gone tomorrow. I heard this week about somebody who knew someone who went to Thailand, went to a place, had unprotected sex, ended up with HIV. Why? For 10 minutes of pleasure. Some people today are pursuing that. Other people are attempting to find life's meaning through possessions, but you know what happens? No matter how many possessions you have, you're faced with the issue of, do you have enough? Somebody asked John D. Rockefeller, an oil magnate, how much money, Mr. Rockefeller, is enough? And you know what he said? Just a little bit more, just a little bit more. And so no matter how many possessions you have, when you have enough, so those who pursue possessions find that their life is meaningless and it's never enough. Those who pursue pleasure find that sometimes it's fleeting and it comes with consequences. Those people who pursue pleasure through getting drunk, there are consequences. One of my best friend's son in high school got his car, went to a party, got drunk, really, really, really drunk. His other friend was riding with him. The drunk friend said he was going to take his other friend home because the other friend was even drunker than he was. Well, they got it in an accident. And my friend's son wasn't hurt, but the other 17-year-old ended up as a quadriplegic. Why? Because of one night of pursuing pleasure. So what I'm trying to say is when we go through Ecclesiastes and we see these big themes, we have to move from what he says to then connecting it into our situation. So what do we have today? We have verse 12. Please follow along in your Bibles. There's a Bible in the pew in front of you. Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verses 12 through 26. Those of you who don't have it in a Bible in front of you, feel free to turn on your cell phones. I take no offense, but stay off your Facebook, okay? Don't be texting anything. Don't be tweeting. I do not allow tweeting during a sermon. You may tweet after my sermon. But take a look and find the Bible, Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verses 12. What we see is he's moved from thinking about pleasure. He's moved from considering possessions. And now what does he turn his thoughts to consider? He turns his thoughts to consider, on the one hand, wisdom, and on the other hand, madness and folly. So the first thing I want you to see as we take a look at what he's saying is that there's a contrast between wisdom and madness and folly. And that contrast helps us realize what the meaning of wisdom is. Now, when a lot of you hear the word wisdom or think the word wisdom, you're thinking about the really smart person or something like that. But when we come through Ecclesiastes and read through the Old Testament, often the word wisdom carries with it the connotation of someone who's seeking moral excellence. Wisdom is doing what is right in a way that pleases God, whereas folly is disobeying God or saying that there is no God at all. So on the one hand, we have him comparing a life of wisdom, and on the other hand, we have him comparing a life of folly. What does he find? Well, the first thing we find in verse 12 is that he asks this question: what more can the king's successor do than what has already been done? Now think about what this means. And this is a problem that we have today in our world as well. We always look to the king's successor to solve the problems of the prior king. Okay? Think about what just happened in our last election. When 44 left office, then 45 comes into office, and 45 tries to fix everything that he thinks went wrong during 44's time and to address all the problems. But what political ruler can fix all the problems? What president that we have now or president that we have yet to come can fix poverty, crime in the inner cities, the tax problem, the national debt? So the writer to Ecclesiastes looks at his life and realizes that, you know what? Nobody can fix it. It is how it is. And the king's successor, what more can he do? Only what the guy did before. And did the guy who came before fix the problems? Absolutely not. So he's scratching his head and he says, okay, well, if that's the case, that these problems that we have in our world are always going to be there, then how do we make sense of it? And the first thing he says, as he begins this comparison, is he says, wisdom is better. When you compare a life of wisdom to a life of folly, what do you find? Wisdom is better. He says, I saw that wisdom is better than folly, just as light is better than darkness. And then he gives this illustration, verse 14. The wise have eyes in their heads, while the fool walks in the darkness. The wise have eyes in their heads. What does that mean? It means that people who are wise see what the situation is and respond according to wisdom. Whereas those who are fools, they're walking in darkness. They don't have any light. They don't have any direction. and they do stupid things. Now think about it in our life today. Do we have wise people whose lives reflect good? And then do we have fools on the other hand? Absolutely. We have a lot of people out there who are eating too much, drinking too much, smoking too much, sleeping around too much. These are the people who are the fools who are walking in darkness. And then on the other hand, we have the people who are living a careful life. They're trying to please God. They're trying to honor God in their relationships. They see their body as the temple of the Holy Spirit, so they don't want to pollute it with something or eat too much or drink too much. And that's the first thing that he finds. You know what? It's better to be wise than to be a fool. So even though often we're hitting the conclusion that the writer to Ecclesiastes hits, which is that life is meaningless, life is meaningless. In the midst of your meaningless life, don't forget the fact that it's better to live a wise life than a foolish life. Don't ditch the commandments of God and the standards of God as you come into your existential angst of realizing, you know what? What's the second thing he finds out? You know what? Even though wisdom is better, the end of both the wise person and the fool is the same. Verse 14. But I came to realize that the same fate overtakes them both. The fate of the fool will overtake me also. What then do I gain by being wise? I said to myself, this too is meaningless. Because ultimately, here's what he's realizing. Even if you try and live a good life, you try and be a good student, you try and get good grades, please your parents because grades are really important to your parents. And then you graduate, you go to a good college, you get good grades, you graduate from there, you get a good job, you get a nice house, you find a nice spouse, and all those things line up that are supposed to line up in your life. You know what? Even if you compare your life with the dropout, the person who didn't finish school, the person who's the drunk bum in the streets that you pass as you drive in to Boston City, even if you compare yourself with that person, the end of both is the same. This too is meaningless. Verse 16, for the wise, like the fool, will not be long remembered. The days have already come when both have been forgotten. You know what's even worse than the fact that all of us are just going to die and it doesn't matter if you're living a wise life or a foolish life? You know what's even worse is the fact that generations from now, nobody's even going to remember your name. Stan? This is what I think about. You know what I do in my spare time? I walk through cemeteries. I do. And I love going to a new city. I remember when I went to Seoul, Korea in April of 1994. And I was so excited because I was going to a church conference, and the conference was meeting at this church, and this church had a cemetery behind it. And I'm like, sweet, I can go read all the tombstones. So during the break time, I went out and I read every single one of the tombstones, and I tried to find out about these people whose lives nobody remembers and whose names everyone has already forgotten. And it was a very moving experience. Let me try and bring this into your own life right now. I know you think you're important, and I know you think your parents are important, and you might even think that your grandparents were important. But I have a question for you today. Can anybody here in this room name the full name of your great-grandfather on your mother's side? Can anybody do that? Your great-grandfather on your mother's side. Raise your hand if you can do that. I don't have my visor on, so I'm going to give you my lizard eye as I'm looking at the congregation. Can anybody do that? Remember your great-grandfather's full name on your mother's side. Anybody can do it? Do we have, okay, come on up. Somebody can do this. Come on up. Come on up. I saw a hand. Come on up. Are you saying there's something wrong with my mic, or are you actually raising your hand? Come on up. No. Do we have a person? What? Oh, sorry, come on up. Oh, this is my friend Tim. We went to high school together. He dropped in today, and we're very happy to have him. Come on up, Mr. Godby, and tell us, I forgot that you'd be here today. You remember everything. Oh, we have two people who can do it. Okay, come on up first. please tell us your full name and then the name of your full name of your great-grandfather on your mother's side.
Christy Monahan Hartono, and my grandfather is Augustus Espersted.
Not your grandfather, your great-grandfather.
My great-grandfather.
Okay, great. On your mother's side?
On my mother's side.
Say it again.
Augustus Espersted.
Wow, that's sweet. Okay, everybody give her a hand. Mr. Godby?
My full name is Paul Timothy Godby II. Good grief. And my great-grandfather on my mother's great-grandfather was James Clifford Brown Hampton.
Whoa, okay. Well, that's very good. Now sit down. You just... On the one hand, I can say, you just proved me wrong. On the other hand, I can say, you just proved me right, because most of you can't do it. In fact, I would say that there's probably only one or two people around, and I would think we have one missionary family that our church supports who can do this. Anybody know which missionary family we have who could name not only their great-grandfather on their father's side, but their great-great-grandfather on their father's side? Anybody know the name of our missionary family who can do that? Stand up. James Hudson Taylor. The first, second, or third? Okay. Okay. Which one is the great? Okay. Think of James Hudson Taylor V, who my wife taught at Bethany Christian School years ago in Taipei, Taiwan. Think of James Hudson Taylor V, who just got married, and I keep in touch with him by Facebook, and he's in the Taiwanese military right now. We need to pray for him. He's thinking about his great-great-grandfather on his father's side. Was that James Hudson Taylor the first or the second? Figure it out. His great-great-grandfather on his father's side. What was it? Right, the first. Okay, so I'm going to move on. But my point is this. Did I not illustrate what the writer to Ecclesiastes just said? We remember James Hudson Taylor I. Why? Because he was a famous missionary to China. He was so famous that now we're continuing, and his family has continued to name every son after that. James Hudson Taylor V. The next one will be the 6th. After that will be the 7th. After that will be the 8th. Until Jesus comes back, I'm sure we will have James Hudson Taylors. But the point is unless you come from the James Hudson Taylor family and have a line of succession like that, people are going to forget your name, and your life is going to mean absolutely nothing 100 years from now, because nobody's going to know your name. And nobody's going to go visit a cemetery and go look around and try and find your tombstone. I got really excited recently before the retreat. Do y'all remember our retreat speaker, Dr. Fisenmeyer? Seminary teacher at Gordon Conwell Seminary. I was really excited because we had lunch with him, and he told me that one of the people whose tombstones I'm looking for, since I took this position in Boston, he actually knew where it was. In fact, he had preached on top of the man's tombstone who I wanted to find in New England. And I don't know how this came out in conversation, but he shared with me that recently he preached in a church where George Whitefield, one of the evangelists of the Great Awakening, was buried under the pulpit right there. So here he is preaching on top of dead George Whitefield and his bones. And so he said he would take me and show me where it was, and I got really excited. Why? Because every single one of us in our heart of hearts, we want to be known for doing something, don't we? That's one of the reasons why we're working so hard. But the writer to Ecclesiastes faces his life and he says, you know what? It doesn't really matter. Martin Lloyd-Jones used to love to use the same sermon illustration about this to point out. He said that the most famous tombstone he could ever think of was this one. John Jones, born a man, died a grocer. And that's all anybody ever remembered, but they don't even remember who John Jones was. But we want to be remembered. We want to do something of significance. We want to be known as a grocer, or we want to be known as a doctor, or we want to be known as a missionary, but ultimately we're not going to be known as anything because our life is going to pass away. And so in this passage, what we have is the writer of Ecclesiastes saying, try pleasure, doesn't work. Try possessions, it doesn't work. Try even searching for wisdom and living a good life so that everybody's going to remember your name. And you know what? people are going to forget your name. So then what's the purpose in it all? And how do you emotionally respond to that great existential moment that he wants to bring us to, where you realize that ultimately your life doesn't have any lasting meaning because you're only here for a time, and then you're gone, and then you're forgotten. So how does that make you feel? Notice what, oh, somebody said what? Somebody said what? I thought I heard somebody say happy. I hope that doesn't make you feel happy. Here's the point. How does that make you feel? Verse 17, he hated life because the work that is done under the sun was grievous to him. Verse 18, I hated all the things I had toiled for under the sun because I must leave them to the one who comes after me. And you know what? I don't know whether the person who comes after me will be wise or foolish, yet they will have control over all the fruit of my toil into which I have poured my effort and skill under the sun. I grew up in a small little town called Titusville, Florida. It's only famous for two things: Dixie Crossroads Restaurant and the Space Center is right across the river from Titusville, Florida. But